So to start the edge grain butcher block top for this, I am jointing one edge of my lumber, and the lumber I'm using for this, the Home Depot by me sells a premium grade Douglas fir, so it's a much nicer grade of lumber than your regular 2x4. I usually buy it in 2x6s or up because those themselves are usually nicer grade than 2x4s, and by jointing one edge and then planing the top and jointing the other edge, you'll get nice square pieces, which is essential for making any sort of laminated top. So I have a video to how to make this jig if you don't have a jointer, and it will be linked in the description below. And I prefer this wood even more so than regular pine because the Douglas fir has a nice reddish pinkish hue to it, which stains nicer than the pine that has a more yellowish hue to it, and it just looks nicer with stain. Um, when you stain regular pine, it definitely has that look of construction grade lumber that has been stained. It doesn't take stain as well as the higher end hardwoods, and I find that this Douglas fir, when you're using it in a situation, I wouldn't use this in a kitchen or a place where you're going to be using your countertops a lot because it is a softwood. But since it's just kind of going in a bar in the basement, this is more than good lumber for that, and like I said, it stains much nicer than regular grade pine. So the other nice thing about this lumber, it's a little more expensive because it's a premium grade lumber, is it doesn't take a lot to get it flat. A couple passes on my planer and it takes out all those valleys and those peaks on the boards. Then I'm going to go through and rip these down to size. On my table saw, I'm going to rip them into strips, all of my pieces. So since you're turning these boards on edge, whatever the thickness is that you rip it is going to be the thickness of your top. So they're looking to get an 1.5 inch thick top, so I'm ripping these strips to 1.5 inches, so when you flip them on their edge, it's 1.5 inch top. Now 2x4s are naturally 1.5 inches thick, but with planing them they're a little bit thinner than that. And then you could see once I have a pile of strips and kind of place them all together, there's really no gaps in all of my pieces. I'm labeling them all because, like I said, after you plane them, they're a little less than 1.5 inches, so you could easily glue these up wrong on the wrong edges. So then to glue these together, I'm just using regular Titebond 3 on all of the parts. I used to just dump it all on there, and it was a lot of excess glue and kind of made a mess, so I've gotten better at putting it on there a little less liberally. And then I'm using some cauls in order to keep everything flat and then clamping it together. And I opted to clamp this together into pieces, so I'll make 3 sections. The top ended up being a little over 2 foot wide, and someone in my butcher block video asked me why I hadn't clamped that up into sections, and I didn't really have a good answer other than I just like to get things done quickly, and when you clamp things up into multiple sections, especially since it's still kind of cold outside, it took me 3 days to do this. But by clamping them into 3 sections, I can now send them through my planer in 3 sections and eliminate a lot of sanding time. So it takes more time to glue them together, but it saves a lot on sanding. So I did take that suggestion and used it on this, and it is a good one. While you're doing it, you kind of want to just bypass that step and glue everything together because it is faster. But like I said, you will be happy you did it. So once all those pieces came out of the clamps, like I said, I sent them all through the planer, and there weren't a ton of high or low spots on these pieces, so it was just a couple passes on all of them. They're a little heavy and cumbersome in my small shop, but like I said, this was a huge time saver when you get to the sanding step when there's not that much to do. I'm gluing these together on the top of the actual bar because I know it's a flat surface, and I had some pieces of lumber that was left over from the doors that have paint on them. So usually with the cauls I put a little tape on them so that nothing sticks. Using these pieces of pine with paint on them is essentially the same principle. The glue doesn't really stick as well to the paint, so I'll be able to pop them off. So I'm putting 3 cauls on there, and I'm just going to glue these pieces together. I'll trim them down to length afterwards, and the nice thing about this is, since it's 3 sections, you only have to worry about 2 glue joints and run out on those glue joints. Now, I know there are people out there that swear by the under-over method of applying clamps to keep pieces flat. I don't necessarily think that doesn't work, but if you apply pressure with these cauls, it just ensures that the piece stays really flat during glue up. So then I let that set up overnight, and that's kind of basically what I have to do when it's colder outside. In the summertime, you don't have to wait as long, but in the colder months, it takes overnight for all this to set up. I could take all those clamps off, and I had very little glue squeeze out on a couple joints. I was able to go through with a sharp chisel and just take all that off. If you're doing this and you have a lot of glue squeeze out, Douglas fir is one of those glues that will stain with Titebond 3, so you want to make sure to get it off if you have a lot of glue squeeze out, because it will stain the lumber and that will show up when in your final finish. So then I was cutting this down to size. It ended up being about 7 feet long, so very simply made a straight edge on one side, and I just freehanded this. I could cut a pretty straight line with a circular saw, freehanded it and trimmed off both of those edges. Once I had this edge trimmed, it was easy to draw a straight line on the other side, and I did the exact same thing. Then I removed those cauls that were underneath the top. You could see how nicely they pulled out because the glue didn't really stick to that painted surface. So then I'm kind of coming to final touches before I put the finish on this. So I screwed those end panels, and I'm going to screw the back panel into place as well, and that's just a matter of using 1¼ inch screws from the inside in order to attach those panels. And then I had never actually glued the back panel together, so this is gluing that together. I glued this up in 2 sections, only about an hour apart, because I needed a big surface in order to do that. So I glued on that bottom rail first, and like I said, because I have all those center marks on there, it was easy to keep everything aligned, and then I clamped all that into place. I let this set up for a little bit because those joints are so tight, you have to hammer off those rails, so I wanted this part to be set up before I started working on the other side. So like I had said before, I made this back panel oversized, and that is because especially with reclaimed lumber, even if your pieces are flat, they undulate across, especially that pallet wood. So the back scribing line kind of undulates as well to follow the fact that this isn't perfectly flat lumber. So once I had that clamp into place, I just made some marks and then I cut this to size. It was basically just trimming a little bit off each end, and like I said, I did most of this with a circular saw, and then you use the hand plane to get it to that line. And then the top I made about 1/4 inch tall, so that whole top had to be ripped down as well. And same process, I made a straight edge based off of my cabinets, and then ripped off that top edge, and then used a hand plane to make everything nice and perfect. And then once I had all that done, it was the same thing from the inside across the whole piece on top and bottom. I'm adding some 1¼ inch screws. You want to make sure you're going through the rails and the stiles and not the center boards, just because the screws will pop through because there is a hollow on the other side of that piece. Then I took my belt sander and cleaned up the butcher block top, and this is when I was really happy I took that advice in the other video in 3 sections, because Usually sanding these down takes a very long time, but since there's really only 2 glue joints now, this process was much faster. I think I started with an 80 grit belt and then worked my way up to 120, and I orbital sanded it a little bit as well, but that isn't in the video. And on top and bottom of the butcher block top, I rounded over the edges so there's nice smooth edges, and that was simply just using a router bit with a round over bit. I think it was a 1/2 inch bit in there. So after I route that round over those edges, I'm going to be attaching this butcher block to the top using some elongated holes. The elongated holes allow for the top to move on top of the cabinet base without allowing for stress cracks. If the top can't move, it could crack and it could split in certain areas, especially since it's pine. So I just drilled 2 1/4 inch holes side by side to make a nice elongated hole. From the bottom, I'll put some screws up into the top with a washer on that screw. And then this is just adding some edge banding to those pieces of ply that are exposed. And then this is the finished cabinet, pretty much ready for paint. So the last thing I'm going to be doing is putting one of those X-shaped wine racks in here. Now, because my opening has a face frame, I have to make this adjustable so it will sit in the space past the face frame. I thought about just taking the backer off and putting it in, but I wanted it to be removable for the customer. So I made just a very long joint in the center so that they'll fit together like a cross, and then if you turn it on edge it's like an X. And then I just went through and beveled out some of that material on either end of that joint so that this thing can be movable, so you could flex it and make it very tall so it can fit into the space, and then it will flatten back out to fit the shape of the cabinet. Now this will have to be cleaned up, but this will also be painted. You could see there how it flexes with those bevels. And this is just made from scrap wood I had lying around. You could flex it and then it will flatten into that space. So I knew the top of this was going to be stained. That's the bottom I already put stain on, so I'm going to flip it over and put stain on the top. And before I apply the stain, I always put a pre-stain on, especially for soft woods or woods that don't stain very well. It just evens out all the tones and the colors in the wood as good as possible. It's not a miracle maker. If your wood is prone to blotchiness, it won't necessarily eliminate that, but it does help a lot. So this is just Minwax pre-stain that you can get at the store. I know you can mix this stuff up, and one of these days I will find a good recipe and just start making it myself. But you put that on there and you let it dry a little bit, and then I'm coming through and putting the stain on. This is a Teak General Finishes stain. I really like General Finishes. It's a little nicer than Minwax. This went on really well, so I just coat that liberally, let it sit there for a little bit, and then wipe all of that stain off. And this is a 1-coat stain. I did not put 2 coats on. So then, like I said, once that had set up for a little bit with a clean rag, I wiped all that off. And you really want to make sure to get all the excess off. If not, it will truly never dry and the finish will stay tacky. But also you could see with this stain, if you leave those streaks on there, it will show up in the final finish. So I really spend time making sure I get all that off. And then I started to clear coat this, and I'm putting water locks on here. I'll put the original water locks on here and then finish it with the satin finish, and this will probably be 3 total coats. Like I said, this is pretty much where things are going to be left off for this video. I started clear coating the top, and that is I'm putting this water locks original finish on there because it's waterproof. And the top, it's hard to see with the sun, is fairly shiny. You could see right there, it's fairly shiny. If you want to keep it at a gloss level, this isn't super glossy, but it does have a gloss to it. You could keep coating it with that water locks. If you want to finish it with a satin finish, after 2 or so coats of that Waterlux, you could put their satin finish on top of it, and it'll take that shine out. Inside the cabinets, I don't think I'm going to paint them. I think I'm just going to clear coat them, and I might spray that, but that won't be in this video. And I don't remember if I said it in a previous clip, I've been testing out paint for the bottom. They knew they wanted the top stained. With the bottom, we've been testing out color combinations, and I don't think they want the full panel painted. And the nice thing about these end panels was I could test paint on there, and this is the back side. So I could flip it and start fresh if they don't want this. But I think what we're going to settle on is staining the wood the same color as the top, and then painting those plywood panels. You can see on the other side I did another test piece with that stained outer edge and the painted center, and that paint job will not fit into this video mainly because this is where I'm at, and I don't like breaking up these builds. I like making them continuous, so in order to release this video I'm just going to avoid showing the painted part. And then next week when I upload a video, it will be probably the fast version of building this, and this should be done and you'll see the finished look. But in general, this is pretty much, I think, what it's going to end up being, with those stained edges, which is easy. This is already ready to go, and then I just paint the inside.